Hey everybody, I'm Alex and I'm here with
Wade.
and welcome to Retire with Style. Wade, what are we talking about today, man?
That's right. Today we are talking about additional reasons why the 4% rule might be too low. And in particular, we're getting to the topic of variable spending, where you don't just stick to having the same inflation adjusted spending amount throughout retirement and how that can have a big impact. And in particular, this is going to be a two-parter. We'll talk more about how to think about evaluating different variable spending strategies in this episode. In the next episode, we'll actually talk about different variable spending strategies. So quite an agenda.
Quite an agenda, but before we get to that agenda, let's add some variety, right? What do we any chit chat talk today, or are we spent? Are we spent?
We are out of chit chat.
That is a nice shirt. Is that light starch, or did you just put it on right out of the dryer?
Uh, it looks like it has been ironed at one point. I haven't been wearing these shirts too often, but I do have a local speaking engagement tonight, so that's why I'm
Oh,
a little
really?
bit more dressed up than usual.
Yeah. Has that been kicking up since post-COVID?
Oh, it has. Yeah, especially October next month, or actually by the time this airs, may already be right around October 1st. It's going to be my first travel month that really looks like a pre-pandemic style travel month. Not the busiest month I've ever had, but certainly it wouldn't look out of place pre-pandemic for sure.
Yeah. I remember it was kind of tough just to like lock you in on meetings. And don't
Right.
forget the collar stays, man. Don't forget the collar stays. They make all the difference.
Yeah, they do. These shirts, I think, have the shorter ones. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter. I don't have them in right now, but I'll be wearing a tie because otherwise it
I think those are the
looks
best
weird.
conference shot skis I've ever gotten. I think Orion years ago gave us these collar stays, and I, I treat them like Bitcoin codes. I take them everywhere, just in case. All right, man. Is that good? Did that
They
suffice?
always get through the airline security. I always worry about those.
Oh, the metal
Just they're
ones? No, no,
metal and they're a
no.
weird
These aren't
shape,
metal.
but I've never had any issue with them. So.
Yeah. Now this is a plastic resin. No, I don't know what the hell they are.
Yeah, one time my son had well, kind of like Hot Wheels, but it was a bullet train, a little bit bigger than a
Yeah.
Hot Wheels, but metal. And in the X-ray at the airport, it kind of shows up looking pretty dangerous. So they had to search his, my 4-year-old son's bag to find out he had a bullet train Hot Wheels type car in
Well,
there, and that.
I'm sure when you go through the security, the name foul just lights up all sorts of alarms.
I suppose so.
Although, in the interest of everyone, Wade led me on to getting the TSA pre-approval.
Oh, you
My
finally did
goodness,
that. Yes,
my
yes.
goodness,
I've
you
been
you
for
haven't
years.
lived, you haven't lived until until you do that.
Yeah, Alex travels quite a bit, and it takes 30 minutes one day to get TSA pre-check. And instead of doing that, he spends hours in the normal security line. I never understood that, but
You,
finally, you've entered the 21st century.
Wade, you're just cutting me up in front of everyone. You're just cutting me up. Goodness gracious.
I
No,
can't live
no. You're
without
right.
TSA pre-check.
Of all the things you've said, that's the best advice I've gotten from you. That's the one that's resonated the most with me, the TSA pre-check. So
Yeah,
if
it's
anything,
always when
I
we're
thank
together in
you.
airports. I
Yeah,
go
he
right to the
feels
TSA pre-check, and then I have to wait 20 minutes for you to go through the regular
Wade's
security
Wade's
line.
such an elitist. He walks by, looking at me with this disdain look. While,
Don't have to
while
take
I'm-
stuff out of my bag. Don't have to take my
yes,
shoes
yes.
off. It's great.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Variable spending strategies.
Yeah, and just
Wait, wait, wait.
so as a quick reminder on that, so we're talking about reasons why the 4% rule it may be too low. We've talked about how real world retirees spending may not grow with inflation throughout retirement, how retirees might use broader portfolio diversification, how they may have a buffer asset outside the portfolio that they can coordinate with, how 30 years might be too long of a time horizon. And then now the two issues that we have left, but they're really quite closely related. So it's hard to say one without the other, but it's the variable spending. Retirees may be flexible to adjust spending in retirement. And also retirees have other reliable income from outside their investment portfolio, such that even if they deplete their investment portfolio, it's less harmful. It's not catastrophic. And therefore, by having that capacity to bear market risk, they might decide to behave more aggressively, spend more aggressively, invest more aggressively, with the understanding, because it's tied into this idea of variable spending, maybe you can make some cuts to that portfolio distribution and not destroy your retirement. So that's where we are today, is the variable spending and the fact that how that relates to having resources outside the portfolio as well.
Now, the point of departure, I just want to make sure that everyone, is on board here. Is we've been talking about sustainable withdrawal rates, but we've been talking about them in terms of the constant spending strategy so far, the 4% rule, or those spending strategies. There's known as constant spending strategies, even though the dollar amount may change from year to year because it's the 4% rule. It takes that nominal amount and then it adjusts for inflation, so it'll be different year after year. They're still referred to as a constant spending strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and constant real spending.
There you go.
Your inflation-adjusted spending is constant. So.
Yeah, but nominally,
nominal.
Yeah, absolutely. But nominal changes. This now we're entering the world of variable spending strategy, which is another way of looking at it. And so, wait, sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, yeah, and maybe some more clarity there as well. Earlier, we talked about things like David Blanchett's spending smile and so forth. That is a variable spending strategy, but that would be a pre-planned variable spending strategy where you know in advance. It's not based on how your portfolio is performing, but based on just your spending needs, that you won't have constant inflation-adjusted spending. Now we're adding in this element of you don't necessarily know exactly how much you're going to spend in the future because you will make adjustments based on how your portfolio is performing. So it's variable spending in the sense that you're actually responding to your portfolio's performance and adjusting your spending. When your portfolio does well, you might spend more. When your portfolio is not doing as well, you may make some cuts. That's what we mean by variable spending.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure we lay the groundwork for that. And there's a few extra components to this that require analysis, simply because there are many different types of variable spending strategies, which we'll run into. I mean, in this episode, what we're trying to do is very much just lay the groundwork for how to make apples to apples comparisons among all of these spending strategies. Would you say that's a correct assessment?
Yeah. In this episode, we need to provide some context about how you can even compare, because if you compare two different variable spending strategies, they may have very different spending experiences. And how do you decide among them, or how do you decide between them? So we need to lay some groundwork for how to think about evaluating different variable spending strategies.
Okay, and what's some criteria around that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, to start with, there's a few different things you can be thinking about. So how much does the strategy respond to the market performance? Like the 4% rule would be there's no response. It doesn't matter if markets are doing great, markets are doing poorly, you're going to keep spending the same amount. But the first kind of thing to consider is like, how much deviation will there be? Markets doing well versus markets doing poorly. How much do you want the spread between how much spending might adjust between those different types of scenarios? You might also look at, are you more interested in a strategy that starts with a higher spending level, and because of that may have more likelihood to decline over time, at least in inflation-adjusted terms? And that might be something that appeals more to a front-loading preference. Or are you someone who is more comfortable starting at a lower base, but then being more likely to increase that spending over time? And that might be more of a backloading preference.
And so I'm glad you said that, Wade, because I had it on my kind of things I wanted to introduce is, if you're listening to the words we're actually using to describe variable spending strategies, you think about probability based, right? And that's obvious because we're in the market and it's probability based. But really, optionality comes to the forefront now when you're talking about this flexibility of spending strategies. And you mentioned front loading as well, these secondary RISA factors. But one of the primary RISA factors is commitment orientation and optionality. This really drives home the point of optionality, because you are, and distribution focus, this accumulation focus versus distribution focus and optionality is you're willing to have that variable paycheck. There's a big picture that you're playing. That's the plan that you have, this bigger picture, right? And you're willing to concentrate on that bigger picture in exchange for this variability of income. You're fine with that variability of income and that optionality. You need that construct to be able to implement that.
Right. And that's where, so we've talked a lot about the 4% rule concept and how it's really not a usable strategy. Like something academics would say about the 4% rule is, if you want a volatile investment portfolio, which the 4% rule assumes, you need your spending to also be volatile or to fluctuate, to be variable. If you don't want variable spending, you really don't have any business using a volatile investment portfolio. And so in the broader context of the total return strategy, because it's probability based, because it's using the market, and because you want that optionality, it really does suggest there should be some open-mindedness to the idea of using a variable spending strategy. And if you don't have follow-up with that, let me.
No, I'm sorry. Wait, I'm trying to work on my.
Yeah, it looked like you were balancing your checkbook over there or something.
No, I'm just trying to. I don't know. Trying to work on my give and take, my listening skills. I was reading a book and it said, "Hey, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason." So I'm kind of implementing it.
Very well. Well, the other kind of issue too to be thinking about, just in terms of broader issues of how do you want to evaluate different spending strategies, is how much volatility do you want to allow within the spending strategy? Now, generally, a strategy that might have bigger fluctuations in spending might allow you to have a higher average level of spending because it's taking on more risk, but the risk spending may go up, but it also may go down by more. And is that something you're comfortable with versus a strategy that may not fluctuate as much with the spending, but nonetheless would have a lower average level of spending over that retirement horizon? And that's the 3 kind of broad issues to be thinking about. And then what we get into is the issue of how do you compare different variable spending strategies? Now, the 4% rule, safe max type concept, or anything with constant inflation adjusted spending, we hear so much about a probability of success, which is measuring how frequently the portfolio does not deplete in that retirement. Now, some episodes back, we had David Blanchett on the show, and I don't remember our exact conversation, but I know one of the big points he often emphasizes is he hates the probability of success. So I'm hoping he talked about that in our episode. Probably he did. And an issue with that is just that for some of these variable spending strategies, you can't even use a probability of success, because if it's a very variable strategy, it's going to keep cutting spending before the portfolio hits zero, so that the portfolio never technically hits zero.
Can I interrupt here, Wade? Just take it a little bit, because we introduced the concept on why he wasn't a big fan of the probability of success. And we said it in previous episodes, but let's just assume we may have a new listener or someone forgot as well. Ultimately, when we're talking about probability of success, within a stochastic model, within a Monte Carlo simulation kind of method, what you're doing is you have an expected return, and you have variability around that expected return. So it can create many different types of runs, many different simulations. And so let's say you put in a portfolio expected return with a volatility component, and how much money is going to go in and out, over during their lifetime. And so you do 1,000 of these. Now let's just make it 100. You do 100 of these, right? Out of the 100 runs, and let's say, and one more point, let's say the end number that you want, the portfolio value at the end, you never want it to be below 0, because you don't want your ending value to ever be below 0. You can put whatever number you want, but let's say below 0, right? And let's say you do this 100 times. You run 100 simulations, and 90 of them end above 0, and 10 of them end below 0, or 0 and below, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be a 90% success rate, in terms of 90% of them were good, 10% of them were bad. But think about this, and from a binary standpoint, it's either yes or no. They either succeeded or not, right? There's no magnitude of failure. The 10 that didn't succeed, maybe they failed by $1. Maybe they failed by $1, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the 50 of them that succeeded by $3. There's really no difference between those runs. But
Right.
because it had this magical number of 0, then above and below, but I don't think it's I don't think anyone's psychologically any more comfortable winning, ending with $3 in the bank than with negative $1 in the bank. It's really the same outcome. And
Mm-hmm.
so from that vantage point, that's a problem. I agree with David there. There's always these sayings. Look, you'd rather be approximately right than definitely incorrect. I get that comment, and it's a good barometer to see where you're going. But from the point of view of Monte Carlo and success rates, you really have to take that into consideration, because that's a huge, huge caveat. What's the magnitude of the failure for the ones that failed? And that's where it's an issue, as opposed to it being more of a progressive thing, like you're 80% of the way there, you're 90% of the way there. That's not what Monte Carlo is answering. Other things answer that, like a funded ratio and things like that. Wait, sorry, I just wanted to do the little what's it called when a book, there's a little page that's like gray that you can reference.
Call out box or something.
Yeah, this is
Yeah,
a
no,
little call
that's
out
important
box
to.
for the podcast.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the point is, if you fail, you might have failed by $1, you might have failed by $100,000. The probability of success just, it throws away a lot of information by only defining each outcome as yes or no, fail or not fail, which actually I was using a bit of a bad analogy, because that's a definite problem with the probability of success measure. But I was, in the context of variable spending, another problem is just simply that you can't use the probability of success, because a true variable spending strategy would never let the portfolio hit 0 in the first place. Instead, it's because it's lowering your spending rather than keeping your spending up, but letting the portfolio drop to 0.
And let me give
So we
a
can't
little
use it.
let me give a little call out box for that one too, just because I think, again, if people haven't been listening in, it's good. So if you're using a constant withdrawal spending strategy, this is where, okay, you have a nominal amount and you adjust for inflation, but that amount remains the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's assume there's never inflation. Inflation is 0 every year, right? And you take out $10 the first year, and there's no return on the investment. Eventually, you will run out of money. As you take out $10, let's say $100,000, whatever. Eventually, you hit 0, and you go out. If
Mm-hmm.
you're doing a variable spending strategy, which is a percent of the portfolio, technically speaking, let's say you take 4% of the portfolio the first year, 4% of the portfolio the next year, 4% the third year, 4% the fourth year. You're not going to run out of money, technically, even if you're taking out 3 cents.
Right. Or even if you're cutting up that last penny, but
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
technically from the perspective of software, it never hits 0. And
Yeah,
therefore,
exactly.
it never, you can't have failure in that context, which is why we have to look at something different. And that's where some years back, I created this idea of a pay rule, which isn't used as the metric to evaluate the strategy. It's all these other factors we were talking about before, like the direction of spending, the volatility of spending. That's really like how much spending varies between different portions of the distribution. That's really how you evaluate the strategies. But to compare them on an equal footing, to have the same amount of downside risk, I go to the pay rule. And in a way, the probability of success is a kind of pay rule, but it's more limited. It's like a very specific example versus a broader general theory. So that the pay rule is, pay stands for probability that your wealth drops below a certain A amount by year Y of retirement. So an accepted probability that wealth falls below A by year Y of retirement. And when you decide on a pay rule to use, you can start to compare. That calibrates the downside risk of each strategy. And then you can evaluate the strategies on these other metrics that we've mentioned.
So wait, what you're able to do here is take all of these variable spending strategies and give it uniformity for analysis. So you
Hmm.
meet, and this is important. I mean, there's many folks that read, you pick up a journal, you pick up a magazine, you pick up even the Wall Street Journal will start having these kind of articles. Hey, this person has this super duper variable spending strategy, that, et cetera. And there's 10 of them and they all look good and you want to sort of make sense of them all. The payroll gives it that sort of, I don't know, there's something in software that it sort of uniforms it all out for you. I think the most amazing advancement with the payroll, Wade, is that you are actually able to pick out an acronym that spells out pay. Right?
Yeah, it was really cool. Initially, I was calling it the XYZ rule, but then later figured out pay is much better.
So again, pay, the P is the probability that you accept. The A is the amount of wealth. And the Y is the certain number of years. And doe is a female deer.
but like I was also saying, so Bill Bengen's SafeMax idea is an example of a pay rule. It's just an example of a pay rule that isn't broader for evaluating variable spending. But the 4% rule idea, to just recall that idea, it was based on the historical simulations, rolling historical data, those 67 numbers that Alex thought weren't enough, but based on those 67
All right,
rolling
wait, you wanted me to go
periods.
into why they're not enough? You can't just,
No,
you can't just do a drive-by. No, I'm kidding.
Listen to that other episode. But you accept a 0% probability that your wealth drops below $0 by the 30th year of retirement. And so that's the implicit pay rule of Bill Bengen's SafeMax. It's just to have a variable spending strategy that A can't be zero. And that's the main issue. So you can accept, say, a 10% probability that my wealth drops below, say, $100,000 by year 30 of retirement. That's a pay rule that calibrates the downside risk on different variable spending strategies. That gives you a way to evaluate them. And like, I think kind of what you're alluding to. So like, one of the most famous examples of a variable spending strategy that we'll talk about more in the next episode is Jonathan Guyton's, and now the Guyton and Klinger decision rules. But when he first came out with that, he was talking about how you could increase the safe withdrawal rate. Well, there's an important caveat on that. Yes, the initial withdrawal rate is higher, but that's because it builds in this capacity to cut spending throughout retirement. And that's where, well, how do you evaluate the downside risk of that? Sure, I can start with a higher initial withdrawal rate if I have to cut my spending by 90% later on, for example. But that's not necessarily going to be a better strategy. But how can you even start to compare the strategies? First, you have to accept a level of downside risk that you're going to apply to all the different strategies. Then you can start to compare the distributions of how the strategies perform in different market environments, how much spending might fall in different market environments, how much it might go up, what it does on average, and so forth.
But when you say level of downside risk, when you say level of downside risk, you mean like, what is the nominal value of the portfolio that you don't want it to go below?
Mm-hmm. Nominal or real. You could define that A amount as a real amount or a nominal amount.
Okay, but I just want to make sure it's not like I don't want my portfolio to ever go down 30% a year. That's not the downside risk we're measuring. It's the downside risk of the amount of money in your portfolio.
It's right. It's not the returns on the portfolio. It's I don't want the amount of remaining wealth to drop below a certain threshold more than P% of the time. Yeah.
By a given number of years.
Yes, by Y number of years into that retirement.
No, that's pretty clever, Wade. I mean, in the true sense of the word, you're able then to really give everything an even standing. But you're also able to do it in a way that's relevant for that individual person. What I mean by that is, you may be, look, I never wanted to go down $250,000. I never wanted to go down $150,000. Everyone has their own sort of level.
Mm-hmm. And that relates to the safety of margin too, that we've talked about. The reason why the 4% rule might be too high is you might not want your portfolio to drop to zero. So the pay rule, in a way, is incorporating a safety margin. But then all these factors interact as well, like the longer the retirement horizon, so the bigger the Y number, maybe the smaller you're willing to accept for the A number, because I might not want my wealth to drop below $500,000 by year 20 of retirement, but I might be willing to let it drop below $200,000 by year 40 of retirement. So either of those could be pay rules, but then you just really need to decide on which one you want to use for the analysis so that you have that equal footing again to start comparing different variable spending strategies.
Okay.
The other big thing to talk about in this episode is, well, how do you actually choose a pay rule, or, what makes sense? Should you accept a 10% probability or a 20% probability that wealth drops below $500,000 or $200,000 by year 25 or by year 35? Kind of what goes into that? And so a conservative pay rule would be some combination of accepting a lower probability that the wealth drops below a higher amount by a shorter period, a smaller Y number of years in retirement.
Can you take us through an example, Wade? Just because this, I can imagine people listening in, it's just a little tougher to conceptualize, when we're talking about numbers like this. And incidentally, you may be listening, a normal question could be, how do payroll calculator, let me Google it. That kind of, there's no payroll calculator out there. This is something that we've done internally. We do offer it, as part of our retirement to our retirement researcher online community. That is a paid service, though. So this is not something that's available just out there. What I would take away from this podcast is, what are the levers that this helps me think about, in terms of creating this. If this is something that's of interest to you, then I encourage you to go to retirementresearcher.com and check out the membership stuff. And I know Bob does outros in which he discusses it, and there's always a link on the show notes. But this is something that's internal to ourselves, but this is how we sort of analyze it. But there is value in discussing it simply because this is a way to make everything an apples to apples comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have the payroll calculator for the Academy members. And there's most of the commercial financial planning software doesn't deal with the variable spending. So this is, I don't know if it's 100% unique. I think there may be other software out there that can also look at this sort of dynamic spending, but it's still pretty rare, at least. And so indeed, if you're not an Academy member, it's more how to think about variable spending and how, as you pull these different levers, what it can do. And that's where, when we talk about some different variable spending strategies in the next episode, behind the scenes, I'm evaluating them with this payroll calculator from the Academy. But I'll talk about kind of the findings or the implications of that. But back to this issue of choosing a payroll. It's a lot that goes into it. So we're trying to think about, how much downside risk am I willing to accept for my retirement? And so some factors that go into that. And so we'll just kind of define this as what goes into using a more conservative pay rule. So allowing for a smaller chance of depleting assets or of letting my assets fall below a certain threshold. Well, it's how much reliable income do you have? And so that's where this series of podcasts is about total return as a strategy. But actually, now that we're talking about variable spending, this is where all the different retirement styles, the total returns, the time segmentation, the income protection, and the risk wrap, they all have a discretionary spending piece that uses distributions from an investment portfolio. So that's where, like, if you're using income protection, or if your style is income protection, you have reliable income to cover your core spending need outside of your portfolio. And even if your total return, you at least will have Social Security as a reliable income source. And that is important. That impacts how much risk you're potentially taking to having a bad retirement experience if markets don't do well. So if you don't have as much reliable income from outside the investment portfolio, you don't have that cushion to help protect you from market volatility, because you don't have these stable income sources that are not impacted by market volatility. And because of that, you probably want to use a more conservative pay rule. You want to take less risk with potentially depleting or like having a smaller safety margin of what's left for your investment assets.
And what what would be a conservative number here? Because I can imagine that many folks listening in have trouble even knowing, okay, is a 10% probability that my wealth falls below 150,000 too conservative, too aggressive, too moderate? What are some zip codes here that people can start
Uh-huh.
working with?
Well, first, yeah, that 150,000 you mentioned, maybe in the context of $1 million starting point for
Yeah.
retirement. Yeah, so like the 4% rule, again, it's not, if you switch over to Monte Carlo, it's really kind of saying you're accepting a 5 to 10% chance based on historical data, not based on kind of the fact that interest rates are lower and so forth, but a 5 to 10% chance that your wealth drops to zero by year 30 of retirement. Now we can relax that a little bit, maybe say, kind of a moderate type pay rule, except a 10% chance that your wealth drops. So if you started with $1 million, say drops below 150,000 inflation adjusted by year 30 of retirement. And if you wanted to make that more conservative, maybe you accept a 5% chance that your $1 million drops below $200,000 by year 30 of retirement. If you're wanting to be more aggressive, you might accept a 20% chance that your wealth drops below $100,000 by year 30 of retirement. And I used year 30 for all three examples, but you could vary that. So if you're more aggressive, maybe you switch year 30 to year 25. If you're more conservative, maybe you switch year 30 to year 35. So that's hopefully giving a sense of kind of broad parameters there. Now, asset allocation fits into that as well, where the 4% rule tells you to use 50 to 75% stocks in retirement. So some sort of asset allocation in that range. A more conservative investor might not go that aggressive with their asset allocation, and maybe a more aggressive investor would go to the higher or slightly higher end of that asset allocation range as well.
And wait, for folks that are listening, how is this not the same as someone, as opposed to saying, I'm going to use the constant example, a 10% probability that wealth falls below 100,000 over a 30-year time horizon? How is that not just, this is kind of framed in the negative. What about if we framed it, 100 minus 10 is 90, a 90% probability that wealth is above $150,000,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, they're the same thing, but right, the framing matters. That's back to that behavioral.
I just want people are listening, so I want people to think, hey, isn't that because I'm assuming people get Monte Carlo scores from their advisors and say 90% chance of success. This is not the same, and I want you to kind of explain.
Yeah. So we're talking about a 10% chance of failure. That would be a 90%. So a 10% chance that your wealth drops below $100,000 is equivalent to a 90% chance that your wealth stays above $100,000. And that framing of the good outcome might make a difference about how people internalize the concept. But yeah, just mathematically, they're equivalent. And so you can work with either approach. So thank you for that insight, Alex.
Here, I'm at your service, Wade, at your service.
So another factor that kind of guides the decision around a pay rule is just how much flexibility do you have with your spending? Can you make cuts to your portfolio distribution without disrupting your lifestyle? To the extent that your spending is more kind of essential, fixed, maybe growing with inflation, you may not have flexibility to use a variable spending strategy. And if you don't have that flexibility, you need a more conservative pay rule to help protect you from having to make cuts to spending. So the flexibility around spending is very important. The more flexible you are, the more aggressive you can be with how you think about a pay rule.
And one of the keys here that you said it in the last one, in terms of fewer reliable income sources, Wade made a point to say we make a distinction between discretionary and essential expenses, right? And what Wade was saying previously in terms of taking an account of your reliable income sources was, listen, these other quadrants in the RISA matrix are assuming for core essential expenses, you have reliable income. So everyone is going, most likely you're going to institute some sort of variable spending strategy, at the very least for discretionary. Now, this point is specific to total returns in the sense that within a total return construct, other than Social Security, you're you're looking at a spending strategy to fund both your essential and discretionary. And if you don't have that flexibility, as in like you may have a lot of essential expenses you need to fund, from your entire portfolio because Social Security may not cut it for you, then that's going to affect here how much flexibility you have in the sense of, i.e., how much can you go down over time, right, Wade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's really the kinds of issues you want to be thinking about. Yeah, so the next one is maybe not entirely different from what we were just talking about with reliable income, but a sense of your reserves. And in the context of the funded ratio, how we think about assets as reliable income, diversified portfolio, and reserves. Well, if you don't have much in the way of reserves, you will likely lean towards having a more conservative pay rule as well. So if you don't have a buffer asset, if you don't have insurance to protect you from different spending shocks, if you don't have like excess wealth, you're overfunded for your retirement and so forth, then it's harder to take risk. And so you're going to lean towards calibrating your spending discussion to a more conservative type of payroll.
Yeah, and so what you're seeing here, so Wade has pointed out lower flexibility, fewer reserves, fewer reliable income sources. In the previous podcast, we kind of went through an item list of why the 4% rule may be too high, which, effectively are these kind of issues. And so if you are vulnerable to these kind of issues, then you need to take a more conservative approach when it comes to analyzing your variable return strategies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, another one that we can just mention briefly, because it is the A number in the payroll, but if you have a stronger desire to have a margin of safety built into the plan, that would translate into using a higher A number. And you don't want your wealth to drop below you want a lower probability that your wealth drops below a threshold, or you want to keep your wealth above a certain threshold. And so a desire to have a bigger margin of safety would translate into a more conservative payroll.
And the last one I would say, or one of the key ones, because it's probably the why in the payroll, is fear of outliving your assets. How, if you do think you're going to live a very, very long time, or the flip side is your assets are, the way the dynamics work, the assets are low, you may outlive them. You want to pick a fairly conservative,
Mm-hmm.
a fairly conservative, I don't know, a time horizon.
Yeah, that backloading preference. If you're more worried about outliving your money, that would translate into a more conservative payroll. Or again, broadening this discussion beyond just total returns, what we see with the RISA is a more concern about outliving your money. More of that backloading preference tends to correlate with income protection or risk wrap. And all these factors interact, because if you're then using one of those styles so that you have your basics covered, well, now you have the offsetting factor. You have more risk capacity at this point. So you might go with a more aggressive pay rule. But just generally speaking, leaving aside, assuming your total returns, if you're a total return style, but you have worry about outliving your assets, that would translate into a more conservative payroll. Which, if it's not obvious, and which we'll get to in our variable spending strategy, would then translate into a lower spending level for that retirement plan.
There it is, Wade.
Yeah, that gets us through the background of about how to compare different strategies. The next step will be to actually discuss some of the main variable spending strategies out there. And that's what the next episode will be about.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, have a great week. We'll see you next week.